I'd like to introduce our first speaker, my colleague Janet Benson from the Learnovate Centre in Trinity College Dublin. And Janet helps organisations around applying best practices in relation to learning theory and learning design. And she will talk today about the top tips for transitioning to online learning. So over to you, Janet.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Nessa. Not so sunny here in Sligo now today, but it never really is. So, so I'm going to share my screen now, hopefully, and you'll be able to see my slides. So today we're going to talk about the power of digital learning, and I'm going to start a little bit around digital transformation in general, digital transformation of your business, but again, we focus on learning at Learnovate, so I'll be looking at best practices and guidelines for digital learning and online learning in particular. I want to cover a small section on online collaboration because I think that it's something that often when we move learning online, we don't give it enough weight when we look at people working with each other. So I'm going to talk about best practices for online collaboration. And then briefly at the end, we're going to talk through some useful tools that we know that some of our industry partners and our clients have been engaging with, but also tools that we've been using ourselves at Learnovate and found useful. So to start off, I suppose, in relation to the current COVID situation, Learnovate were tasked with providing guidance to some companies, to kind of industry in general and to academia around moving online and some distance education top tips. So we have that infographic on our website, and if anyone's interested in getting a copy, it's very high level, but again, it has some kind of interesting high level tips for when you want to move your learning online. So I'll talk a little bit about digital transformation, and I kind of like the way sometimes it's referred to as the fourth industrial revolution. If anyone needs a reminder of the other three, I wrote them down. So being steam, electricity, mass production, and digital. So the fourth industrial revolution is very much around industry 4.0 and, you know, the use of AI, machine learning, etc. So there's a kind of a definition here that I like, that digital transformation is the strategic adoption of digital technologies. And I highlighted the word strategic there because it's definitely not a case of just bringing in random tools for learning for any kind of digital move. It has to be a very strategic top-down approach and a very definite decision to make when you're looking at digital transformation. I suppose, why do people do it? Why do businesses do it? It improves processes and productivity. It can deliver better customer and employee experiences. And again, when we come to look at learning, it's very much around scaling your solutions, so being able to reach a lot more people in a lot more countries. So again, it involves the implementation of digital tool solutions, but also processes. And I think that's very important to highlight, is that you can bring on board plenty of digital tools, but if you don't have the processes in place to actually support those tools, then it can sort of lead to a failure of that digital transformation implementation. So there's a couple of questions I think here that companies should ask of themselves if they're going to digitally transform. Number one, can my company model its existing processes? So can we model what we already do in an online environment? And also that digital transformation requires strong support from upper management. So if you're in upper management yourself, or you have upper management in your company, you have to make sure that the support is coming from the top down. And that actually comes from the research in general around online learning. Any kind of new implementation of a new strategy, it definitely requires a top-down approach, and also that employees see that management are on board with it. It ensures that they're then also kind of on board with it. So that's really important. Just a small quote there, I guess, from the Harvard Business Review. It's not just about the technology. It really is changing the way you do business, and it's not just a simple software upgrade, or it's not a process improvement project. It's a strategic approach to how you're going to do your business. So it's worth keeping that in mind if you're looking at digital transformation. But even if you're just looking at digital transformation of your learning, it's look at the entire process. So when we look at digital transformation of learning, there are a number of opportunities that are open to us. So number one being flexibility. So I think one of the main things around adult learning is that they want to have a kind of control over their own learning experience, and allowing people that flexibility to do the learning how and when they can is really important. I think even if you're offering your online learning in the workplace, there's still a level of flexibility there as to when people take their learning and do their assessment, for example. But particularly, I think in the current environment that we're in, where people are working from home, etc., allowing people to learn at their own pace and to be able to do things when they have the time, for example, around childcare, etc., very useful tool for learning. Again, scalability. So as I mentioned earlier, the online learning experience offers businesses a chance to reach a lot more people, to kind of scale their entire learning offering, to reach people in lots of different countries, in lots of different ways, and lots of different places at different times. And I think that's a very valuable asset to have. And again, when you look at learning management, so a company can have a better control over what the learning experience is, and also if you're using something like a learning management system, it's much easier to see what learning is occurring, what's working, get feedback from learners, etc. So that there's a really good learning management offering there. And so again, when we look at, adult learners in particular, autonomy is very important for adult learners. So having a level of control over their own learning. And online learning definitely offers that level of autonomy. If you can try to provide your learners with sort of a more personalized learning experience, and I do talk about that here a little bit, it makes them feel more in control and part of the actual experience, which can be very motivating, particularly for adult learners. So offering them that level of autonomy is really important. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too, when we look at the likes of collaboration, etc. And active learning. So active learning is, as you can imagine, it's the opposite of passive learning. So if anyone's ever been in a passive learning experience, it tends to be just a kind of a one-way transfer of information. So for example, a trainer in a training room providing information, a lecturer in a lecture theatre, and the learner is not involved in the experience. So active learning involves the learner in the experience. It involves collaboration with each other. It involves activities, interactions, etc. So digital transformation of learning offers that kind of opportunity. And again, with opportunities come challenges. So some of the challenges that we see around digital transformation of learning kind of range for reluctance to change. So again, if you have a company, your senior management might not necessarily be on board with bringing in a new way of doing things. And often it's the employees as well who can be reluctant to the change. They kind of think, well, what's the point? What's in it for me? Everything's fine as it is. And again, technical challenges. So we know that there are challenges with regard to people adopting technology, being able to use certain technologies, and also we have issues with broadband, Wi-Fi, and I can tell you that being in the west of Ireland, that definitely can be a technical challenge, so something to take into account when you're looking at moving your learning online. Engagement is a really big one with online learning. So think about, when you have people in a room, it can be easier to engage because you're physically present. Whereas in an online environment, engagement can be difficult because you're not seeing the person. You're not sort of, getting those sort of body language cues as to whether they're engaged or not. But there are techniques to engage learners in the online environment. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later on, but it's something that I think people really need to be aware of, that engagement is massive, one of the bigger problems that when we move to online learning. And motivation as well. So think about any adult learners or employees you have. It's often the what's in it for me kind of situation. Why am I doing this? I'm not motivated to do this online. I'm on my own, I'm at home, whatever, and I'm not motivated to do this. So there are ways again to motivate learners in the online environment. So again, motivation and engagement often kind of go hand in hand. So we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So again, we're going to talk about collaboration and interaction. So again, it's that active learning experience where we want the learner to interact with the learning experience, with the person who's delivering the learning, and with each other. So that level of collaboration with other learners is vital when you want to do a digital transformation of your learning, and not to kind of overlook that element of it. And then with assessment, that can often be challenging. People aren't sure how to do assessment online. It's very easy, I suppose, to do a quiz or a test in a face-to-face kind of environment, even to get feedback. But assessment can be challenging online, but it can definitely be done. And there are lots of different and interesting ways to do assessment when you digitally transform your learning. So I think for anyone who's here at the webinar today that actually works in learning development, often the question, and I know from even going to lots of different online learning or learning in general conferences, what does the future of learning and development look like? What is our role going to be in the future when learning goes online? And I think it's something that's really interesting, because I think the roles for learning and development professionals are changing. So we're moving away from, and I suppose if there are people here on the call or on the webinar that are in L&D, we're often seen as order takers. Here's a piece of learning, here's a PowerPoint, can you just put that online for me? And we're definitely trying to move away from that sort of order taker role. And from the research, it looks like the future of L&D will be as change agents and consultants. So again, being involved in the change, in the learning process, in involving other members of your company in the change to move digital, and also designer of that enriched learning portfolio. So I think there's that whole move from the kind of standard format of the LMS or very formalized learning paths to something that's resources, not courses. And I think people might have heard of that. It comes up a lot at a lot of different learning conferences. And I think it's a nice way to look at it. It's more of a curation type role. And also, I mean, L&D in the future should really be shaping innovation culture. We need to be innovative. We need to look at to see what's coming. And again, that's to kind of get our learners on board, that we're keeping an eye on what's going on and that we're constantly moving forward. And the two, I've added these separately because these aren't from the research, but these are sort of my own interpretation of what L&D is going to look like in the future. I think it is definitely going to be more of that curator role. So, you know, curating resources, finding learning that's out there already that's working for other companies. And again, there's a level of research there as well. So working with other companies to see, well, what are you doing that's working really well? What are, you know, other industries doing that's working really well for them? And to adopt some of those sorts of approaches, some of those courses, to curate some of those resources for your own company. I think that's what L&D is going to look like. And again, less of that sort of, here, take my PowerPoint and put it on the learning management system, which is obviously good news for L&D. So I'm going to move into some of the best practices and guidelines for digital learning. But before we start, we have a little poll that we'd like you to take just to find out in general how many that are here are already offering online learning and to what level. So I know we have a poll on the go, and I think Linda is going to keep an eye on the poll. And we can come back to some of the answers that we're getting from that poll. But I think even as the poll is running over the next minute or two, I think I can continue with my slides. So Linda, if you want to give me the answers,
Yeah,
when we
I will
have them.
do.
Great, thanks, Linda. So I'm kind of breaking down the best practices and guidelines for digital learning into sort of the company, into the L&D team, and then sort of into the employee or the learner. So as I mentioned earlier, when we're implementing anything new, if we're moving to digital learning, again, it has to be a top-down approach. Management have to be on board with anything that's being done. And often, I think if you're in an L&D role, you want to bring in something. If you don't have the management backup to say, yeah, this is great, you know, to get the employees on board with it, then it's less likely to succeed. And that actually comes from the research. Again, L&D people will be very aware of this, but doing a pilot is really useful. It's really useful to pilot a small course on a small group of learners to kind of find out, well, what's working, what's not working, get feedback from learners, you know, pivot what you're doing if necessary, change what you need to do so that when you bring that digital learning experience to the wider audience, that you've kind of fixed some of the things that are wrong, and try to make the experience as good as possible. Again, you know, change management is huge and something that we tend to overlook. We assume that we bring in something new and employees are going to straightly, you know, get on board with it, really into it. But again, there is a level of change management that we have to engage with to ensure that people are going to be on board. And part of that, I think, is involving the learners in the change. So, you know, getting their feedback, finding out what works for them, etc. And something interesting that came out of actually a learning technologies conference I went to a couple of years ago was the concept of the learning campaign, or something that I'd really called a campaign for learning. So it's sort of that, you know, bringing that level of excitement, or, you know, to kind of advertise your new learning. So think about, you know, like a movie trailer, for example. You know, this learning is coming. This is what we're going to be doing. It's going to be really interesting and engaging, and it's getting people on board before they even have, you know, any kind of online learning or digital learning experience. I think it's nice to get people on board before it, and even to get excited about it. But we know that could be, you know, a little bit of a challenge. But I think, you know, getting people as engaged or as interested as much in the process is really, really vital. So when we look at best practices and guidelines for digital learning for your team, your L&D team, successful digital transformation begins with an understanding of your consumer behavior. And when we talk about consumer, we talk about learner here, their preferences and choices. So again, something to talk about at Learnovate a lot is starting with the problem and not the solution. So I think anyone that's here who has, you know, sort of gotten on board with a digital solution often thinks about the solution first. And I think it's very much that we need to have a look and see, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And I think for people who are in L&D here on our webinar, it's kind of looking at, well, have you done your learning needs analysis for your face-to-face learning, for example? And if you have learning outcomes and you've done a learning needs analysis, can you take some of that and use some of that information for your digital learning experience? So again, what is the problem you're trying to solve, and then how are you going to solve it through a digital learning? So focus on the learner. So I say here learner personas because, again, at Learnovate, I'm part of the innovation services team as well, and we do a lot of workshopping. And one of the things we look at are the personas of our learners, and that persona can be quite developed, as in what are their motivations, what are their barriers to kind of getting their learning done, you know, what is it that we need to know about them to make sure that the learning is going to work for them. So it kind of makes sure that we're aiming it right at the right kinds of learners and at their particular challenges, can really enhance the success of your digital learning experience. And the big no-no for me, and I say this quite a lot, is, as long as you just don't put your face-to-face content online, I think you're doing pretty well. I think often, it's assumed that, well, we have this face-to-face content, and if we just put it on a learning management system or online, that's it, job done, digital transformation done. But again, we know that doesn't work. We know that's not really learning. It's more just sort of delivery of content, and it's not a learning experience as such. And a really simple one is around personalizing communication. So if you're communicating with your learners, even using their names in communication can make them feel like they're part of the learning experience. And I think that's really important. And it's something that, not to be underestimated, it seems very straightforward and common sense, but it into the experience. Linda, did you want to share any of the results of the poll?
There's lots. Sorry, can you hear me okay, Janet?
Yeah, can. Yeah.
There's a lot coming in saying Zoom, Google Hangouts, Microsoft Teams, and some are using learning management systems as well.
Okay, so a lot of people are actually doing some digital learning as it is, so that's great. And again, some of those tools I'm going to talk about later, so it's good to hear that people are actually already using them. So thanks for that, Linda. So again, we're going to move on to best practice and guidelines for your learners. So it's very much, when it comes to your learners, it's about setting expectations, and that's sort of in advance of the learning experience, but also just before or when they're coming on to an online, say, a synchronous face-to-face online session. Setting expectations is important. People know what to get out of the learning, what they're expected to do, and what's the purpose of this online learning. So again, when I go back to adult learners, it's the what's in it for me. Why am I doing this, for example? And when we come to setting expectations too, I think it's important to think about those technical elements that I mentioned earlier. So can people use the tools that you're going to use? Can they get access, for example? And what do you do, in the situation where someone has bad broadband or they can't get online? So again, provide learning on those tools. So don't assume that people can use anything. I think even when it comes to a learning management system, it's good to have a sort of an introductory video or some kind of navigation to make sure that people know how to use the tool. Because again, when it comes to adult learners, they can be demotivated when they feel like they can't do something. And it's good not to assume that anyone knows how to do everything that you're going to throw at them. So again, when we come to active learning, we need to look at interaction and activities. So what kind of activities can we facilitate online? How can we get our learners involved in the learning experience? And again, how can we promote sort of interaction with them and the experience and the actual material, but also interaction with each other? So we'll talk about the collaboration piece in just one second. And something that's very important to learning is reflection. So opportunities for reflection sort of allow for that deeper learning experience. So if you can provide opportunities for your learners to reflect on the experience, whether that be, how they've learned, what they've learned, it's very useful because it allows them the opportunity to think back of what they've done, and it provides a deeper learning experience where they'll hopefully remember a lot more of what they've learned based on the fact that they've had an opportunity to reflect on it. Great. So we're going to, sorry, Linda.
I was just going to say the results have just come in there now to me, Janet, just in terms of online learning specifically. And I think the highest kind of is around that they've moved some courses online, but are not fully digital. I think the highest kind of results is within that category. And then there are some, I suppose, that are offering online learning. But I think most fall into that they're not fully digital.
Yeah, and I'd say a lot of that too, Linda, comes from, the kind of the rush to do things online in relation to the current situation too. And I think a lot of companies feel like they've kind of been forced into it in a way. So I wonder how much of that has come from, the current, and I don't want to keep using the COVID word, but whether a lot of it has come for that or before this actually happened, that a lot of companies, and I know companies that come to us, Linda, a lot of people are already thinking about going online. They're doing little bits and pieces online just to try it out. So again, it's that kind of piloting and the trial and error, which is great to see that people are doing. So yeah, thanks for that.
No problem.
So I'll move into a little bit around online collaboration. And again, why collaborate for learning, as I said earlier, it's a key factor in active learning. So getting people involved with each other, working together is really important to involve them again in the experience and not have that passive learning experience. if people understand the theory of learning, there's a nice bit of theory from Levin Wenger around communities of practice. So collaboration builds a community of learners. So people who are learning from each other, learning with each other, actually improves the learning experience when you have people that are interested in a similar subject and they're learning it together. And again, it's engaging people through discussions, problem solving, case studies. I say role plays here. I know myself from working in NLD for a lot of years, a lot of people don't actually like role plays. So again, it's good to find out a bit about your learners before you start to do some of these activities to see if it's something that they're interested in. But the problem solving and case studies are really, really useful to get people engaged and get them, really working together. And when I talk about active learning, again, I'm thinking about, think about the passive learning sessions you've attended in the past, probably had this kind of an experience. So again, it's very much about being active, getting people involved and not just talking at them. So again, when you look at facilitating online collaboration, don't assume anything. Don't assume that people know what they're supposed to be doing. Don't assume that they have the technology, that they know what, how to interact with each other and all that. So it's to give them as much direction up front as possible is really important. And part of that is setting expectations, so establishing very clear goals and objectives for the actual collaborative task or whatever it is they're going to be doing collaboratively. Again, I keep going back to it, but it's about adult learners knowing the whys. And I think often in corporate L&D, we tend to give learning to learners and not explain to them the why or the consequences of, if they do something wrong or, So again, adult learners need to know the whys around why they're doing something. With children, which is quite interesting, you can tell children to do something or not do something, then they often don't ask why. Now, I don't have children, and that's probably not necessarily true all of the time, but it's very much with adults. It's they need to know why they're been asked to do something, and it does make the learning better for them because they kind of go, okay, well, yeah, I get that. I know I need to do that. And so when you're facilitating online collaboration, it's very, very important to promote open, positive communication where all views are respected. We've probably all been in situations with colleagues where one person shouts the loudest or takes over, or there are people that, don't necessarily want to engage. So it's very important to kind of respect all views. There's no such thing as a bad idea, and having that really open and positive communication. And a very simple one, and again, it's kind of that personalized element. Again, make sure you welcome your learners to your online synchronous sessions. So making sure that they feel welcome, that they're part of the experience is really important. And again, sometimes overlooked. And this one I like. So using real world everyday problems when defining tasks to build engagement. So again, look at something that people can apply to their everyday lives, for example. So we call that scaffolding learning. So it's kind of building on something that people already know. But also when you look at the kind of the theory of motivation, for example, it's that element of, relatedness or relevance. So like, is this relevant to me? And if it is, it's kind of something that I kind of understand based on something outside, outside of work, for example. So there's a really nice one here that I thought was kind of interesting. It's around giving an example of how collaborative approaches have worked in the past, in history. So, for example, this one is quite nice. I thought the double helix structure of DNA was discovered by these 4 people. And you kind of think, well, if 1 or 2 of them weren't part of that collaboration, then what would we have discovered when we did? How would things have been different? So again, there's lots of examples through history where people have collaborated and had an amazing outcome, such as this. Maybe not all our collaborations will generate this level of discovery, but we'd like to aim high. So facilitating online collaboration. So we want to focus on tasks that promote problem solving and critical thinking. So again, giving people problems to solve and work together through those problems. And there's lots of different types of tasks you can do for that. And I think it's good to vary the types of tasks as well, so people don't feel like, oh, we're doing this again. So group challenges, brainstorming ideas, collaborative writing, and all of these can be facilitated in an online environment through lots of different types of tools. So again, it's kind of varying, what people are doing to kind of keep them engaged. And it's really important, I think, to separate learners into smaller groups. If you have a big company, for example, you don't necessarily want everyone collaborating all together. So if you can put people in smaller groups to work together and then bring them back to the wider group, that's really useful for collaboration. And again, I'm going to talk about some tools that will help with that. And I think some of the people here, who have answered the poll already are aware of some of those tools. And then rotate the groups as well, so people aren't working with the same people all the time. Just from diversity and an interest perspective, it's good to kind of, move people around. Assigning roles is really important. So when you're looking at people engaging online, again, as I said earlier, there can be the person that tends to take over or, to be the kind of take the leader role. And then you have people who are you may call in the online world kind of lurkers, who they're there, but they're not really engaging. But if you assign people roles, they all know that they have something that they need to do as part of this collaboration. So that can be really useful to get people involved and engaged in it. And as the facilitator, I suppose, of this online collaboration, you start as a facilitator. So you start as the person who, is giving direction, letting people know what they have to do, setting expectations, setting things up. But as you go through the process, you're moving more to a moderator role and allowing people to take control over their own experience. And again, that comes back to that learner autonomy, where adult learners like to have some control over their own learning experience. So if you allow people to move and do things themselves, you're really a moderator then, checking in, making sure everything's going okay, but letting them control the experience. So we're going to talk a little bit about some tools that we've been using. And again, we have a poll, or we can use the chat function that we have as part of our webinar, just to find out what kind of tools and technologies you currently use. So as Linda said, some people have mentioned Zoom and their LMS and stuff like that already, but it'd be nice to get a feel for, some of the tools that people are using and how they're using them as well, because I think that's an important element of it. Like, certain tools are really good for certain things, but if we try to shoehorn other things into them, sometimes that doesn't work so well. So it'd be nice to get a feel for what tools and technologies are currently being used. So I'm going to move ahead, Linda, but if
yeah,
you
great.
have some
Thanks, Janet.
Thanks a million.
Yeah, you'll need to give us a few minutes until we wait for people to place their answers and comments.
Yeah, no problem.
I'll let you know when it's in.
Okay. So firstly, I'm not assuming that, I know we have a lot of small companies on our webinar today that mightn't have an actual learning management system. But if you do have a learning management system, the first port of call really should be that learning management system and what is the functionality that it has. So I know myself from working in L&D and with working with lots of different types of learning management systems, they have different types of functionality that often the company isn't even using or sometimes isn't even aware of. So it's good to go back to your learning management system, find out, well, what functionality exists there already that will help me, to facilitate collaboration, will help me to, do some sort of activities with my learners, not necessarily, as we said earlier, just putting the PowerPoints online and maybe having a quick quiz at the end to say, well, or as we often know, it's just a tick box exercise. Did you complete the learning? And what I like to refer to that is, when I was working, is read and understand, but it's actually read and forget training. So I think it's good to have a look at your learning management system if you have one, and just see what it can do. And again, some of them are a lot more sophisticated than others, but even the basic functionality can be useful to engage your learners. So I think some of these are going to be relevant to some of the people that are here on the webinar. Some useful tools for communication and discussion. And I mentioned Zoom and MS Teams here specifically because of the breakout room function, which is really nice. So again, I've mentioned these as communication discussion tools, but also this is a really good one for collaboration, because with those breakout rooms, it allows you to let people go off and sort of engage with each other in smaller groups and then bring them back to the wider team. And it's something like we use Zoom at Learnovate for our workshops, for example, and it's a really nice tool to let people go off in their smaller groups and do a few bits and pieces and then come back. So discussion boards and forums as well, really good for asynchronous discussion, get people asking questions, engaging with each other. For example, some learning management systems actually have discussion boards or forums on them. If you're using something like Moodle, there's a really good discussion board there where you can ask questions and get people to answer and engage with each other, which is really useful. So at Learnovate, we have Slack, which is really good for just keeping in touch with each other. You can break it into sort of different channels for different things. So whether you have different teams, different groups, different topics, for example, but also we have a Slack channel for kind of more social things, which is really nice as well. And I think that's something to maybe be aware of, is that, I'm thinking about now in the current situation where people are at home, for example, they're maybe not engaging as much with people at work in an informal or social way. You're not having that chat at the, in the kitchen when you're making your tea, for example. So having a sort of a social element to your discussion, I think is really useful to kind of just make people feel like they're still part of the workforce. And again, everyone uses WhatsApp and Viber. Whether people want to use it for work communication or not, that you'd have to ask people. But again, WhatsApp is just really handy to be in a group, and if you're just asking questions around learning, for example. And I suppose a lot of companies don't really want to involve, their employees in social media in through work, for example. But if you have a work Facebook, for example, you can use it more formally and have a Facebook group where you can get people involved in discussions, for example. And a lot of companies do that because I suppose it is free, and for companies that are smaller, it's a good way to kind of get people together and get them involved in discussion. So I want to go on to some useful tools for collaboration, and I'm nearly done now. So I suppose me sort of giving out about, not been talked at. I want to make sure I don't do that and bore people too much. So when we're looking at collaboration, I think everyone's heard of Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is just a type of wiki, which is basically a kind of an online platform for adding information and editing other people's information and stuff like that. So again, it's sort of like, a simple form of like the actual Wikipedia, where people can make edits and suggestions, for example, but it can be good for online projects. E-portfolios and online blogs are really useful, such as WordPress and Weebly. Again, they're free, but the element of those that I like is that the e-portfolio or the online blog provides that reflective or opportunity for reflection that I mentioned earlier with regard to our learners. And it also offers sort of peer-to-peer feedback. So a lot of these sorts of online blogs have a kind of a function where you can make comments on other people's blogs, for example. So if you were to ask questions or suggestions, that kind of thing allows for that kind of peer-to-peer feedback, which is quite nice. And a lot of people are using the likes of the Google Suite, Google Docs, Sheet Slides, or the Microsoft 365 alternative. And again, these are working documents, live documents that people can make edits to at the same time, or asynchronously. And again, that's really useful just for even when I think about when we write proposals, when we're putting together presentations, that we can do it together and collaboratively. So I wanted to just show you one of the tools that we've been using at Learnovate. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the innovation services team, and we do a lot of workshopping. And due to the current situation, we've obviously had to do a lot of that workshopping online. So we tried a couple of tools such as Miro and Mural, and we just went with Miro because it was the one that worked best for our needs. But you can see there, I just put a little screen up of a very basic Miro board, and this would be one that you would probably use for kind of ideation and innovation, coming up with some ideas. But it's very simple to add post-its for lots of people to be on the Miro board at the same time. You can upload documents, you can upload PowerPoints, images, etc. There's also a chat function. So it's something that we would do at Learnovate, where we would have someone on a Zoom, or people on a Zoom call, and then also have this board that's live. And it's really useful because then you can download it afterwards and have all the information from the workshop. So it's a really nice tool for workshopping, and I think it's something that that we've been using really nicely, but we're still experimenting with. So there's a lot of templates that are already uploaded into it that are really useful for lots of different things. So I think it's really nice and a really nice tool. And finally, I hope I hope that's okay that I'm nearly done. I really like this slide because it's very much around trial and error, and I like the fact that sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. So I think any of us who are involved in learning know that one of the best ways to learn is to make mistakes, and if you can make mistakes and show that you're learning from them, your learners will appreciate that too. So make sure you get them involved in the process. Let them know that we're doing new things, but we're finding our feet. So I think don't be afraid if you try a tool, it doesn't work, try something else, because that's all that we can do really. And in the current situation and with moving online and all the tools that are out there, the best thing is to just try to do what you can and learn from it. So I think that's really important.
Great.
I have some references there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Linda.
Thanks, Janet. So I was just, before we take some questions, Janet, from the audience, I just wanted to let everyone know that if you're having problems with trying to get into the chat, you can watch the chat on our website by using the link that we sent you on your email, or you can go to our website, which is www.learnovatecentre.org, or if you click on the button at the event, where the event is advertised at the top of the page, you'll get to the chat there as well. So Janet, just wanted to ask you one or two questions that have come through. So what can we do with learners who don't want to engage?
Really good question. So again, as I was saying earlier, you can't make assumptions about people. Some people will want to engage, some people won't. And again, I think it's about finding out more about your learners and what it is that they are willing to engage with and what they really don't want to engage with. So again, find out, what are their motivations? Why would they not want to engage online, for example? Is it a fact that they just don't, have the tools, the capabilities? Is it that, for example, if they're at home, that they're just too busy with whatever it is that's going on? I would say the simple response to that question is just find out more about them, and figure out ways to engage everybody in some way or another. So again, when I talked about the collaboration type thing, it's about assigning roles to people maybe that even suit them. So again, people might not necessarily want to do, as I said, like a role player, for example. They just hate the thoughts of it. And I know when we have people coming into workshops, there are certain things that people don't like to do, but it's about bringing them on board and making sure that they know why they're kind of going to be doing different things and the reason for it and what's the outcome, so what they're going to get out of it. I think that's really important and not to be kind of underestimated, if that makes sense.
Perfect. And we'll take one more question, and we'll also have questions at the end of the presentations as well. So please do keep sending in your questions to us. So the next question, I suppose, is really around, and this is something that I'm always asked as well, is around the differences between tools of communication and tools of collaboration. I think people get confused with those.
Yeah, that's true. And you know what? The reason for that is I think a lot of the tools can be used for both. So as I was saying there earlier, like the likes of Zoom and MS Teams is, I suppose, effectively a communication tool, as in, we want to communicate with each other. But again, using those breakout rooms can be useful for collaborative activities. So again, it's about looking at the tools that you have and what you can use them for. I think that's really important. It's not that we're putting them into boxes to say, well, this is for collaboration, you can't use this for communication. It's about, what do I want to achieve? And I always go back to, okay, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the learning problem that, or the learning outcome that we want to get? And then how do we facilitate that with the technology, rather than, well, here we have this technology. Do you know what we'll do? We'll shoehorn some learning in here and just hope for the best. So again, as learning professionals, I think we do need to look at, what are the learning problems we're trying to solve? And then how will the tools facilitate that or help with that,
Great, that's brilliant. Okay, Janet, I'm going to now move on to our second speaker.